Hey guys, what's going on? It's your favorite ethnarch of all crippledom. And today I wanted to talk about the fact that disability is not necessarily political. And you're probably sitting there thinking, uh, like, what do you mean? We live, we live in a politia. um, and you would be right. What I mean by disability not necessarily being political is the fact that up until really at the earliest the 1950s ish in the Soviet Union, dealing with disability on a political level that had, you know, legislation behind it or actual government practice wasn't a thing, uh, aside from, for example, veterans returning from war. And that's still kind of the most accessible or most accepted form of disability worldwide, I would say. Um and really we were left out of the political process pretty much by omission. And what I mean by that is that no one gave a crap about what our needs were until that point. Um and no one cared about integrating us into wider society until, you know, um the Soviet Union started to roll out a lot of its um policies, again on a state level, of okay, we need to help accommodate disabled people or and stuff like that. And the thing is, it still had its issues, guys, because it was primarily based around the what they call the medical model of disability, which I talked about in uh previous videos, where essentially um disability was treated as something to be fixed, and that a laborer couldn't be fully integrated into society until his disability was fixed. Now sometimes um this was just as much as what we would call today, um accommodation, right? But still the prevailing um sort of, I, I guess philosophy behind that is that they need to become like everyone else, right? That this disabled identity doesn't really exist. Um and the same is true for the United States for most of its history, even up to today, right? Like, first we started with the charity or tragic model, right? And, we were still kind of completely isolated from society, but at least we were taken care of. And then you got the medical model, which eventually led to eugenics, right? We people started saying we shouldn't even be around, which is, I'm sorry, even to this day, that type of thinking is still around. It's a natural consequence of the medical model. We have a lot better science today, but even in rhetoric, it's coming back with especially the dark medicine that I've talked about a lot on my channel, of course. And yeah, so you know, just using two of the biggest economic and social powerhouses as an example, um we were still the only support system we had, if we had one at all, was our families, especially our mothers, right? Because I'm sorry, guys, but patriarchy is real, and men do tend, especially when stuff like disability is involved. I'm not saying that mothers can't do it either. I've heard of mothers doing it as well, but typically men tend to abandon their families, especially when disability is involved. Um, you know, because um doing anything to care for another human being is typically like that's feminine, right? And I'm of course glad that despite a brief spell of absence at the beginning of my life, my dad has was firmly present and stuff like that for the most part. But yeah, and that's part of the reason, if you ask me why I'm so much for the traditional nuclear family still, is because proponents of from its um liberalization slash abolition in some cases really don't think about what something like that could spell for disabled people, because I have to be honest, man. um I don't trust the wider community to be able to take care of me. um and honestly, there are just some forms of care which best come from the person that either birthed you or took care of you the longest. There are little secrets which, only a parent can know about. I'm sorry. That's just it. Um, and despite the dreams of anarchism and communism and socialism, uh, I just, because of my own experiences and the experiences of my disabled comrades, I don't think that the abolition of the family is a good idea, especially given the role that it's played in disabled life. Once again, as I say, sometimes being the only positive institution which serves us. Um, and yeah, I'm gonna give another example, guys. Like, I've told this many, many times, but I came from Guatemala. I was born in Guatemala City, and I came from a very illustrious family, especially on my dad's side. On my dad's side, his mother's father was um head of Guatemala's central bank in the 1940s under Jorge Ubico Castañeda. Um, and his grandmother, my great grandfather's grandmother, was a disabled feminist, literally. Vicenta La Parra, Mama Chenta. Um, and she published the first two feminist newspapers in Guatemala as a disabled woman. Um, which is unfathomably based. And then his wife, she came from a criollo, an American, and I mean American in the broad sense, like Central American, born Spanish family, um, with ties to uh Pampoquila in Panajachel, guys. Um, and I think she was a model and a muse for a poet and like one of the first female race car drivers and stuff like that. Um, and then my grandfather on that side was uh an economist and an accountant like my great grandfather who was in the military and had originally immigrated from Costa Rica. So, and my mom was a model for Cerveza Gallo. And we were very well off, guys. I had in the beginning a tutor and stuff like that. Um but that didn't matter. Excuse me, even though we were at the top of the Ladino mestizo hierarchy, guys, basically almost at the top. I mean, we we couldn't be at the top because none of us were 100% Spanish except some of my great grandparents. But like, you know, we were very comfortable, man. We but still that didn't matter because the thing is the society wouldn't have ever accepted me regardless of our wealth. It would not have. I was being rejected from schools and stuff. I had to go with a nanny at first, like in uh daycare or pre-K or whatever at like 2 or 3 years old because they said, we can't care for him here because he's not normal. That's what they that's what they said to me, guys. Um and eventually, especially my mom, but also my dad kind of just realized that like no matter how much money we had, my quality of life was never gonna be what it could be here in the United States. And so they decided to come. And, you could say, oh, well, the capitalist superstructure, and even though you were bourgeoisie in Guatemala, um, it you're still part of an American client state, and that comes from exploitation. And I would agree with you to an extent, but I still think it would be quite similar in AES states, guys, actually existing socialist states. I'm sorry. Because, once again, disability is primarily a social problem, not a political or economic one. And it's going to take people and societies generally um work to not do that regardless of those things. Now, does that mean that uh let's say, a socialist or anti-capitalist critique can't be a part of that? Of course, guys. You know that I believe that. Um, and especially with what recently happened in the New York mayoral primaries, like the shift even in the United States is undeniable, even though what we call democratic socialism is actually social democracy everywhere else. But you get what I'm saying. But yeah, disability is primarily a social issue with social solutions, not necessarily always political ones, even if they may overlap. Thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. Bye.